It was 3:30 in the morning on a freezing October night when Harold Morrison heard the sound that would change his life forever. The old man, who had lived alone in his cabin deep in the Montana wilderness for the past 12 years, was a light sleeper, a habit formed from decades of working as a park ranger before his retirement, and the sound that woke him was unlike anything he had experienced in all his 78 years of life. It was a deep, guttural sound, something between a growl and a plea, a vocalization that seemed to carry within it both power and desperation in equal measure. Before I continue telling you this absolutely incredible story that defied everything experts thought they knew about wild animal behavior and that brought together two unlikely souls in the most unexpected way possible, I want you to tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching this video from right now. I really want to know where all of you amazing people are tuning in from, and while you're at it, go ahead and smash that like button because I guarantee this story is going to take you on an emotional journey you'll never forget. And you're definitely going to want to share it with everyone you know once you hear how it ends, so stick with me through every moment of this extraordinary true story. Harold had moved to this remote cabin after the death of his wife Martha, a woman he had loved for 53 years and whose absence had left a void so profound that the only way he could cope was to remove himself from civilization entirely. The cabin, which he had built with his own hands back in the 1970s as a vacation retreat, sat in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, 15 miles from the nearest town and accessible only by a narrow dirt road that became nearly impassable during winter months. It was a simple structure, just 2 rooms with a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen area, a bed, and shelves filled with books that had become his only companions in the long, silent nights. Harold had chosen this isolation deliberately, believing that the solitude would help him process his grief, would give him space to remember Martha without the well-meaning but suffocating sympathy of friends and family who didn't understand that sometimes a person needs to be alone with their sorrow, needs to feel the full weight of loss without anyone trying to lighten the burden with platitudes about time healing all wounds, or her being in a better place now. On this particular night, Harold had gone to bed around 10 o'clock, as was his routine, after spending the evening reading by lamplight and listening to the wind howl through the pine trees outside. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and he had stoked the fire in the wood stove before climbing into bed, pulling the heavy quilts up to his chin, quilts that Martha had made years ago, each stitch a testament to her patience and love. Sleep had come slowly, as it often did, his mind wandering through memories of his life with Martha, their daughter Rebecca, who lived in Seattle and called every Sunday worried about him living out here alone, and his years working in the wilderness where he had encountered countless bears, wolves, mountain lions, and other creatures, but had never once felt the kind of fear that now gripped his heart as he lay in bed listening to that strange sound outside his cabin. The sound came again, louder this time, accompanied by heavy footsteps on the wooden porch that wrapped around the front of the cabin, and Harold could hear the boards creaking under what must have been considerable weight. Harold sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight he kept on the small table beside his bed. He was no stranger to nighttime visitors. Deer often came close to the cabin, and once a young moose had spent an entire night grazing in his clearing. But this was different. The weight of these footsteps suggested something much larger, much more powerful. He swung his legs out of bed, feeling the cold wooden floor against his bare feet, and reached for his robe, the thick flannel one that Rebecca had sent him last Christmas. As he stood, he heard another sound, this one higher pitched, almost like a whimper or a cry of pain, and it was coming from something much smaller than whatever was making the heavy footsteps. Harold's decades of experience working with wildlife kicked in, overriding his fear with professional curiosity and concern, and he moved quietly toward the window, pulling back the simple cotton curtain just enough to peek outside into the darkness, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the clouds. What Harold saw through that window in the silvery moonlight was something that would have sent most people running for their rifle. But Harold Morrison was not most people. Standing on his porch, massive and imposing in the dim light, was a fully grown grizzly bear. And not just any grizzly, but one of the largest specimens Harold had ever seen in his 40 years as a park ranger, easily 700 pounds of muscle and fur, standing on all fours with its enormous head lowered towards something Harold couldn't quite see from his angle. The bear's breath came out in visible puffs of condensation in the frigid air, and its dark eyes, which Harold could just barely make out in the moonlight, seemed to be looking directly at his front door with an intensity that was almost unsettling. But what made Harold's breath catch in his throat, what made him momentarily forget every safety protocol he had ever learned about dealing with grizzly bears, was what he saw next to the massive adult bear. Lying on his porch, small and vulnerable and making those heartbreaking whimpering sounds, was a bear cub, probably no more than 8 or 9 months old, and even from his vantage point through the window, Harold could see that something was terribly wrong with the little creature. The cub was lying on its side, its breathing rapid and shallow, and one of its back legs was held at an unnatural angle, clearly broken or badly injured. Blood, dark and stark against the weathered grey wood of the porch, had pooled beneath the cub's body, and the little bear's cries of pain were growing weaker. The mother bear, and Harold had no doubt that's what she was, stood over her injured offspring with a posture that conveyed both fierce protectiveness and something that looked remarkably like desperation. She would lower her massive head to gently nuzzle the cub, making soft, chuffing sounds that Harold recognized as the vocalizations mother bears used to communicate with their young. And then she would lift her head and look at Harold's door again, as if waiting for something, as if expecting something to happen. It was in that moment, standing at his window watching this impossible scene unfold on his porch, that Harold understood something that defied logic and reason and everything he thought he knew about wild animal behavior after 4 decades of studying them. This mother bear had brought her injured cub to him deliberately. She had traveled through miles of forest in the middle of the night, in freezing temperatures, carrying or guiding her wounded baby to this specific cabin, to his door, seeking help. Harold stood frozen for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities and implications. Every instinct trained into him over his career screamed that what he was considering was dangerous, potentially fatal, that a mother grizzly with an injured cub was literally one of the most dangerous situations a person could encounter in the wilderness. That getting between a bear and her offspring was a death sentence waiting to happen. But another part of him, the part that had spent a lifetime observing these magnificent creatures, the part that had witnessed countless examples of animal intelligence and emotion that science was only beginning to acknowledge, that part recognized something profound in what he was seeing. This wasn't aggression. This wasn't a bear that had wandered too close to human habitation. This was a mother who had made a conscious decision, who had overcome her natural fear and distrust of humans because her baby was dying and she had nowhere else to turn. Harold thought of Martha, remembered the night their daughter Rebecca had fallen and broken her arm. When she was 6 years old, remembered the desperation he and Martha had felt driving to the hospital, the willingness to do absolutely anything to help their child. And he recognized that same desperate parental love in the posture of the enormous bear standing on his porch. If you're watching this and you're a parent, or if you've ever loved someone so much you'd do anything for them, hit that subscribe button right now because you understand exactly what I'm talking about, and you're going to want to hear how this incredible story unfolds. Harold made a decision that most people would have called insane, that his daughter Rebecca would have been furious about, that probably violated every safety guideline the Park Service had ever published. But it was the only decision his heart would allow him to make. He walked slowly away from the window, moving with deliberate care to avoid making any sudden movements that might be visible through the glass, and made his way to his small kitchen area. He lit the oil lamp on the counter, keeping the flame low, and began gathering supplies. From under the sink, he pulled out his old veterinary first aid kit, the comprehensive one he had maintained during his years as a park ranger when treating injured wildlife was part of his job. He checked the contents quickly, noting the bandages, antiseptic solutions, splinting materials, and pain medication that would work on animals. From a locked cabinet, he retrieved a bottle of animal sedatives that he had kept from his ranger days, technically illegal for him to possess now that he was retired, but Harold had always been one to bend rules when the situation called for it. He filled a large pot with water and set it on the wood stove to heat, grabbed several clean towels from his linen cabinet, and then stood for a moment, his hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, asking himself one final time if he was really going to do this. The sound of the cubs whimpering, growing, weaker and more desperate, made the decision for him. Harold walked to his front door, his hand resting on the doorknob, and spoke out loud for the first time since waking, his voice rough from disuse and heavy with the Montana accent he had never lost, despite decades of education and professional work. "All right then," he said to himself, to Martha's memory, to God or the universe, or whatever force had brought these bears to his door. "Let's see if an old man can still make a difference." He slowly turned the doorknob and opened the door exactly 12 inches, just enough to show his face, just enough to let the mother bear see him clearly while maintaining a barrier that might offer a second of protection if everything went wrong. The cold night air rushed into the cabin, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth and blood and the musky smell of bear. And Harold found himself looking directly into the eyes of the massive grizzly from a distance of less than 6 feet. Closer than he had been to a wild grizzly in decades, closer than any sane person should ever be. The mother bear's reaction was not what Harold expected. She didn't rear up in threat display. She didn't roar or charge. She simply looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to be evaluating him, measuring him, trying to determine if he was the help she had been seeking or just another threat to her dying cub. Harold spoke to her softly, using the calm, steady voice he had developed over years of working with frightened and injured animals, a voice that Martha used to tease him about because he would use it on her when she was stressed or upset. "It's all right, Mama," he said, his breath creating clouds in the freezing air. "I see your baby. I know he's hurt. I'm going to help if you'll let me." He had no idea if she understood the words or just the tone, but something in his voice or his posture or perhaps some indefinable quality that animals can sense in humans must have communicated his intentions, because the massive bear took one step backward, away from the cub, creating space between her body and her injured offspring. That single step backward, that gesture of trust from a wild animal that had every reason to distrust humans, moved Harold more deeply than he would have thought possible. He opened the door wider, stepping fully out onto the porch, and the mother bear took another step back, her eyes never leaving Harold's face. The old man knelt slowly beside the injured cub, his knees protesting the movement, the cold wood of the porch biting through his flannel pajama pants. Up close, the cub's injuries were even worse than he had thought. The little bear, a male, had suffered what looked like a fall from a significant height, probably from a tree or cliff face, and the impact had resulted in a compound fracture of the left rear leg, with bone actually protruding through the skin, as well as what appeared to be internal injuries based on the blood coming from the cub's mouth and nose. The little bear's breathing was shallow and rapid, his heart rate elevated to a dangerous degree, and his gums were pale, indicating significant blood loss. Harold had seen enough injured animals in his career to know that without immediate intervention, this cub would not survive the night. Harold looked up at the mother bear, who was watching his every move with an intensity that was almost palpable, and spoke to her again in that same calm voice. "This is bad, Mama, real bad, but I'm going to try, you understand? I'm going to try to save him." He stood slowly and moved back toward his open door, every muscle in his body tense and ready despite his age, half expecting the mother bear to change her mind and attack, but she remained where she was, watching. Harold retrieved his supplies from inside, carrying them out to the porch, and then came the most dangerous part, the moment that would determine whether he lived or died in the next few seconds. He needed to bring the cub inside where he could work on him properly, where the warmth and light would give the little bear his best chance of survival. Harold bent down and slowly, carefully, slid his arms under the injured cub, lifting him with a grunt of effort that reminded him he was not the young ranger he used to be. The cub weighed probably 40 pounds, solid muscle even in his weakened state, and as Harold lifted him, the little bear let out a cry of pain that pierced the night air like a knife. The mother bear's reaction was immediate and terrifying. She rose up on her hind legs to her full height, which had to be close to 8 feet, and released a roar that shook Harold to his core, a sound so loud and primal that it seemed to come from the earth itself. Harold froze, the injured cub held against his chest, certain that he had just made the last mistake of his life, that his desire to help was about to result in his death on his own porch. But he didn't run. He couldn't run. He just stood there, holding the cub, looking up at the massive bear towering above him, and said in a voice that was surprisingly steady, I know he's your baby. I'm not taking him. I'm helping him. You brought him to me for help, remember." Perhaps it was the fact that Harold didn't flee, didn't show the fear that prey shows to predator. Perhaps it was the gentle way he held the cub despite its cries of pain. Perhaps it was simply that the mother bear had already made her decision to trust this human and was committed to seeing it through. Whatever the reason, she slowly lowered herself back to all fours, though her posture remained tense and watchful, and she made no move to stop Harold as he slowly backed toward his open cabin door, the injured cub held carefully in his arms. Getting the cub inside and onto his kitchen table, which he quickly cleared and covered with a clean sheet, took every ounce of Harold's strength and nerve. The mother bear followed him to the doorway, her massive head actually crossing the threshold, close enough that Harold could have reached out and touched her if he had lost his mind completely, but she didn't enter the cabin fully. She simply stood there, filling the doorway with her enormous bulk, blocking out the moonlight, watching as the strange human worked on her dying baby. Harold's hands, which had been steady through countless emergency situations during his career, now shook slightly as he prepared a syringe. With sedative, calculating the dosage for a bear cub of this approximate weight, praying he got it right because too much would kill the little creature, and too little would leave him in unbearable pain during the procedures Harold needed to perform. He administered the injection into the cub's shoulder muscle, and within a few minutes, the little bear's breathing slowed and his body relaxed as the medication took effect, though his whimpers of pain continued, softer now, but still heartbreaking. Working under the oil lamp's golden glow, with a 700-pound grizzly bear watching his every move from 5 feet away, Harold Morrison performed what was probably the most challenging veterinary procedure of his entire career. He cleaned the wound where the bone protruded, using antiseptic solution that made even the sedated cub flinch and cry out. which caused the mother bear to make a warning sound that raised every hair on Harold's body. He spoke continuously, narrating what he was doing in that same calm voice, though whether he was speaking to reassure the mother bear or himself, he wasn't entirely sure. He carefully manipulated the bone back into place, a procedure that made him sweat despite the cold air coming through the open door, and then splinted the leg using materials from his kit, wrapping it securely but not so tightly as to cut off circulation. The internal bleeding was his biggest concern, something he had no way to address properly without surgical facilities. But he administered medication to help with clotting and reduce inflammation, and he set up an IV line to provide fluids, a skill he hadn't used in over a decade, but which came back to him like muscle memory. 3 hours passed in this surreal tableau, an elderly man working frantically to save the life of a bear cub, while the cub's mother maintained her vigil at the doorway, never leaving, never attacking, simply watching and occasionally making soft sounds to her baby. Harold lost track of time, focused entirely on the small life struggling beneath his hands, and it wasn't until the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the cabin windows that he finally stepped back from the table, his back aching, his hands cramped, his entire body exhausted, but his heart lighter than it had been in the 2 years since Martha's death. The cub was breathing more easily now, his colour better, the bleeding stopped, and while Harold knew the little bear wasn't out of danger yet, he had done everything he could do, and it would either be enough or it wouldn't. He looked at the mother bear, who was still standing in his doorway as she had been for hours, and he smiled, actually smiled for the first time in longer than he could remember. "He's going to make it, Mama," Harold said softly. "Your boy is going to make it." The mother bear's reaction to these words, which she couldn't possibly have understood linguistically but somehow seemed to grasp emotionally, was something Harold would remember for the rest of his life. She lowered her massive head, closed her eyes for a long moment, and made a sound that was somehow both a growl and a sigh, a vocalization of pure relief that transcended species. Then, slowly and deliberately, she backed away from the doorway, moving out onto the porch and then down the steps into the clearing. But she didn't leave. She settled herself on the cold ground about 20 feet from the cabin door, positioned so she could see inside to where her cub lay on Harold's kitchen table, and there she remained as the sun rose fully over the pine trees, transforming the forest from a place of darkness and danger into a landscape of breathtaking beauty. Harold watched her for a moment. This magnificent creature who had defied all expectations and logic, who had overcome thousands of years of evolved instinct that told her humans were dangerous, who had made herself vulnerable in the most profound way possible because her love for her offspring outweighed her fear, and he felt something shift inside his chest, some part of the grief he had been carrying beginning to crack open like ice breaking in spring. Over the next 5 days, a routine developed that would have seemed impossible to anyone who heard about it later. The cub, whom Harold started calling Rocky because the little bear's survival seemed against all odds, remained on the kitchen table, which Harold had padded with blankets to make more comfortable. The medication and fluids Harold continued to administer kept Rocky sedated enough to rest and heal without causing himself further injury by trying to move on his broken leg. Harold changed bandages, monitored vital signs, and even managed to get some diluted honey water into the cub to provide calories and keep him hydrated. And through it all, the mother bear, whom Harold began calling Bella because there was something beautiful in her devotion, remained in the clearing. She would occasionally leave for a few hours, presumably to forage and take care of her own needs, but she always returned, and whenever she was there, she positioned herself where she could see her baby through the cabin's window or open door. Something remarkable happened during those 5 days, something that Harold had read about in wildlife journals but never expected to experience personally. A bond formed between the old man and the wild bear, a connection based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Harold would sit on his porch in the cold morning air, wrapped in his heavy coat, drinking coffee from his tin cup, and Bella would be there in the clearing, and he would talk to her. He told her about Martha, about how they had met at a county fair when they were both 19, about their 53 years together, about the hole her death had left in his life. He told her about Rebecca, his daughter who worried about him, about his fear that by isolating himself out here, he was hurting her even, though that wasn't his intention. He told her things he hadn't told another living soul, and Bella would sit there, this enormous predator, and she would listen, or at least it seemed like she listened, her dark eyes fixed on him with an attention that felt almost human in its intensity. And when Harold would go back inside to check on Rocky, Bella would stand and move closer to the cabin, close enough that Harold could have touched her through the window if there hadn't been glass between them. And she would watch him tend to her cub with a trust that humbled him beyond words. On the morning of the 6th day, Rocky opened his eyes fully for the first time since the night he had arrived, and Harold was there to see it. The little bear looked around in confusion, clearly disoriented, clearly scared. But when Harold spoke to him in that gentle voice and carefully stroked the fur on his head, Rocky made a small sound, something between a grunt and a chirp, and settled back down. Harold knew it was time. Rocky was stable, the leg was beginning to heal, and the internal injuries, which had been Harold's greatest worry, seemed to have resolved without causing permanent damage. The little bear would need weeks more to fully recover, but he no longer needed IV fluids or intensive monitoring. He needed his mother. Harold went to the door and called out to Bella, who immediately rose from where she had been resting and approached the cabin. "Your boy's ready, Mama," Harold said, and there were tears in his eyes, though he couldn't have said exactly why. "He's going to need you now more than ever, but he's going to be okay. You saved his life by bringing him here, you know that? You saved him." The reunion between mother and cub was something Harold knew he would carry with him for whatever time he had left in this world. He carefully lifted Rocky, who was now alert enough to struggle slightly and cry out for his mother, and carried him out onto the porch. Bella rushed forward, making sounds Harold had never heard a bear make, sounds of joy and relief and recognition. And when Harold gently set Rocky down on the porch boards, the mother bear immediately began nuzzling her baby, licking his face, checking him over with her nose and paws, making those soft, chuffing vocalizations that Harold now recognized as bear language for love and comfort. Rocky responded to his mother's attention with his own sounds, and despite the splint still on his leg and the bandages Harold had carefully wrapped, the little bear tried to get closer to his mother, tried to burrow into her fur, the way cubs do when they're seeking safety and warmth. Bella lay down on the porch, that enormous body curling itself carefully around her injured baby, and Rocky snuggled against her, and mother and son lay there together for almost an hour, while Harold sat nearby in his old rocking chair, watching this display of pure maternal love and feeling something inside his frozen heart beginning to thaw. When Bella finally stood, Rocky stood too, wobbly on 3 legs with the 4th held carefully off the ground, but standing nonetheless. Bella turned to look at Harold one final time, and the old man could have sworn there was something in that look, some communication that passed between human and bear, that transcended language and species. She held his gaze for a long moment, then lowered her head once, in what could only be described as a nod of acknowledgement or gratitude. Then she gently guided Rocky with her nose, helping him navigate down the porch steps, supporting him when he stumbled. And together, mother and cub began making their way toward the tree line. Harold stood and watched them go, and just before they disappeared into the forest, Bella stopped and looked back one more time, and Harold raised his hand in a wave, a gesture of farewell that felt both adequate and completely insufficient for what they had shared. If this story has touched your heart in any way, if you're amazed by this impossible connection between human and wild animal, please don't forget to leave a like on this video and share it with your friends and family, because stories like this remind us that compassion and love transcend all boundaries, even those between species, and that sometimes the universe brings together the exact beings who need each other most at the exact moment they need each other. In the days and weeks that followed, Harold Morrison found himself changed in ways both profound and subtle. The cabin that had been a place of isolation and grief began to feel different, less like a tomb for his memories and more like a sanctuary where something miraculous had occurred. He still thought about Martha every day, still felt the ache of her absence, but the sharp edge of that grief had somehow been dulled by the experience with Bella and Rocky, as if helping to save one life had reminded him that life itself was still worth living. He called Rebecca that Sunday, as he always did, but this time when she asked if he was okay, if he was taking care of himself, if he was lonely out there all by himself, he surprised both of them by answering honestly. He told her about the bears, about the incredible 5 days they had spent together, and while he could hear the concern in her voice at the danger he had been in, he could also hear something else, a relief that he was finally talking about something other than memories and grief, that he had experienced something new and profound. 3 weeks after Bella and Rocky had left his cabin, Harold was sitting on his porch in the afternoon sun, reading one of Martha's favorite books that he had been avoiding for 2 years because it hurt too much. When he heard a sound from the tree line, his heart leaped in his chest, and he looked up to see a sight that made him set the book down and stand up from his chair in wonder. Emerging from the forest, moving slowly but steadily, was Rocky, and beside him, massive and protective as always, was Bella. Rocky's gait was still somewhat awkward. He would probably always have a slight limp, but he was walking on all 4 legs now, the splint Harold had applied long since removed, presumably by Bella herself. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, about 50 feet from the cabin, and Bella and Harold looked at each other across that distance, and in that look was a recognition, a memory, an acknowledgement of what they had shared. Rocky, seeming to sense his mother's attention was focused elsewhere, looked in the same direction and saw Harold on the porch, and the little bear made that chirping sound Harold remembered from the cabin, a sound of recognition. They came back every few weeks after that, Bella and Rocky, sometimes staying near the cabin for a few hours, sometimes just passing through the clearing on their way to somewhere else, but always stopping, always acknowledging Harold's presence with that same look that passed between them, that same recognition of the bond they had formed during those 5 desperate days. Harold began leaving out food occasionally, honey and berries and fish when he could get it, not to domesticate them or make them dependent, but as a gift between friends, an acknowledgement that they were welcome in his space, just as he had been welcomed into their crisis. Other bears sometimes passed through Harold's clearing, black bears and even other grizzlies, but none of them ever approached the cabin the way Bella and Rocky did, and Harold came to understand that what they shared was unique, a relationship built on trust and need and mutual respect that could not be replicated. The story of Harold and the bears eventually made its way beyond the cabin in the woods, as such stories always do. A hiker passing through the area saw Bella and Rocky near Harold's cabin and reported it to park services, concerned that an elderly man was feeding bears and creating a dangerous situation. When rangers came to investigate, expecting to find an irresponsible old man putting himself and others at risk, they instead found Harold Morrison, who explained what had happened that October night, who showed them the medical supplies he had used, who told them about the bond that had formed between him and this particular bear family. The rangers, many of whom had known Harold during his working years and respected his expertise, documented the situation, but ultimately decided not to interfere. This wasn't a case of bear feeding or habituation in the problematic sense. This was something else, something that defied normal categorization, a unique relationship that had formed under extraordinary circumstances. Word eventually reached Rebecca, who drove out to her father's cabin in a panic, terrified that he was losing his grip on reality or putting himself in mortal danger, or both. But when she arrived and saw her father, really looked at him for the first time in 2 years, she saw something that made her anger and fear dissolve into confusion and then understanding. He looked healthy. He looked engaged. He looked, for the first time since her mother's death, like he wanted to be alive. Harold told her the whole story, showed her the medical records he had kept of Rocky's treatment, the photographs he had managed to take during those 5 days, and Rebecca found herself believing what seemed unbelievable because the evidence was there in front of her eyes, in her father's animated voice, in the way he talked about Bella and Rocky with affection and respect and wonder. She stayed at the cabin for 3 days, and on the second day, Bella and Rocky came through the clearing, and Rebecca stood on the porch next to her father and watched as the massive bear and her cub paused at the forest edge, as Bella looked at Harold with those intelligent eyes, as Rocky made that chirping sound and took a few steps closer before his mother gently guided him back. Rebecca cried, standing there beside her father, understanding finally that sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected sources, that sometimes life presents us with miracles when we need them most. Harold Morrison lived for another 8 years after that October night, years that he later told Rebecca were among the best of his life, despite the grief he still carried for Martha. He remained in his cabin in the woods, but it was no longer a place of isolation. Rebecca visited regularly, sometimes bringing her children, Harold's grandchildren, who listened with wide eyes to the story of Grandpa and the bears. Bella and Rocky continued to visit, less frequently as time went on, and Rocky grew into a young adult bear and eventually went off to establish his own territory, as male bears do. But Bella continued to pass through Harold's clearing several times a year until Harold's own death at age 86. On his last visit to the cabin, a week before a stroke would take him, peacefully in his sleep, Harold sat on his porch in his rocking chair, and Bella emerged from the forest one final time, now old herself, her muzzle graying, her movements slower than they once were, and human and bear looked at each other across the clearing one last time, 2 old souls who had saved each other in different ways, who had taught each other that trust and compassion could bridge any divide, that love in its purest form knew no boundaries. This story, this absolutely true account, that was documented by park services, photographed by visitors, and eventually written about in wildlife journals, reminds us of several profound truths about the world we live in and the creatures we share it with. It reminds us that animals are far more intelligent, more emotional, and more capable of making complex decisions than we often give them credit for. That a mother's love is universal across species, powerful enough to overcome instinct and fear and thousands of years of evolution. It reminds us that compassion and courage are not about being fearless, but about acting despite fear, about choosing to help even when helping might put us at risk, about opening our hearts even when our hearts have been broken. It reminds us that healing from grief doesn't mean forgetting what we've lost, but finding new reasons to engage with life, new connections that help us carry our losses with grace rather than being crushed by them. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that we are all connected, human and animal, predator and prey, young and old, and that sometimes the universe conspires to bring together exactly the beings who need each other most, at exactly the moment they need each other. Before I let you go, I want you to do something for me. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about wild animals or grief, or the unexpected ways healing can find us, leave me a comment below sharing your thoughts, or telling me about a time when an animal touched your life in an unexpected way. And if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because I share true stories like this regularly, stories that remind us of the beauty and mystery and profound connections that are possible in this world, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Share this video with someone who needs to hear a story of hope today, with someone who loves animals, with someone who's grieving, with someone who needs to be reminded that miracles really do happen. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about this incredible story of Harold, Bella, and Rocky. And remember that kindness always matters, compassion always has value, and sometimes the bravest thing we can do is open our hearts to the impossible. I'll see you in the next video.